pleasure to introduce basically our keynote speaker here today, Cohen, who is one of our favorite writers. She was a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. Maybe she'll talk a little bit about why she isn't anymore. Maybe you can guess. But we've had her at several conventions, and her wonderful, wonderful book is here, We of Little Faith. Welcome, Kate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy Laurie and Dan have been incredible supporters and inspirations for years now, and I'm so grateful to you, to all of you for coming. So yes, I am an author, and my most recent book is We of Little Faith, Why I Stopped Pretending to Believe, and maybe you should too. And I'm a former columnist at the Washington Post, the one with the now ironic motto, Democracy Dies in Darkness. I left that job in March when our owner, Jeff Bezos, declared that he would get to decide what I wrote about from then on. And I decided not to hang around to see if that was going to be true. I think leaving was the right decision. Oh, I know leaving was the right decision. But it wasn't an easy decision because until then, I had been welcome to write about just about anything that interested me or upset me. And with that freedom, I was able to point out again and again America's reflexive deference to religion and our chronic neglect of what I think is our country's foundational innovation, the separation of church and state. So I would prefer it if my country kept religion out of its laws, but on the plus side, I never ran out of things to write about. As you see, these are all mine, and they're just some of the columns that I wrote on this topic. The Washington Post, to its credit, never said enough already. And for 5 years, I got to be an unapologetic voice for atheism in a mainstream newspaper. And I got to keep making my case for keeping religion out of public policy. It was a great gig. And for this, I admit, I am grateful to Mr. Bezos. But that was then. And the question for me and for a lot of us here is now. I feel like I wrote We of Little Faith in a different era. I wrote it to encourage non-believers to be honest about not believing in God. And I argue that the more of your truth you can tell, the more you will find meaning in your own life and true connection with other people. And I still believe that. And I still believe that your honesty can give other people permission to be honest. Religion holds back American progress in human rights and civil rights, and together, I argued, maybe we can loosen its grip. I still believe that. But I think that atheists and freethinkers of all stripes have another important role to play. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I want to start instead by telling you the story that I tell in my book, which is about how I lied about my belief for years and why I finally told the truth. First, the lying part. I grew up in a very Christian part of rural Virginia. It was basically fields, cows, and churches. Churches everywhere. So many churches that when I was little, I didn't really know what a church was. It was like the way a fish doesn't know what water is. This, for example, is my nursery school, and as a child, I called this the T school. See, because it has a little T on the front. Part of my confusion stemmed from the fact that I was Jewish. We weren't a very reverent family, but my sisters and I were all bat mitzvah, and we went to religious school and services at the tiny local synagogue. And every Friday, we lit the Sabbath lights and we said the blessings over the bread, the wine, and the candles. Jewish observance is full of those blessings, which are basically repetitive, subservient praise of a supreme being. Blessed art thou, Lord our God, and thank you for the fill in the blank. Bread, wine, escape from Egypt, making my child a boy, not a girl, and so forth. So while I was growing up, I must have praised and thanked God Almighty thousands of times, in Hebrew and in English, but I never believed He was listening. I never believed He was real. To me, the Old Testament God I was praying to wasn't an actual being who took an interest in my middle school problems, or even an actual being who created the earth and then was busy with other projects. He was a character in a story. This is what I thought. A fascinating, unpredictable, slightly crazed character in a story. So that's what I always believed, but it's what I never said. I said instead what I was supposed to say. Here I am, as a bat mitzvah, pretending to believe in a God whose word was deed, whose every command was just and true. In other words, lying. Now, I don't think lying is always a bad thing. Anyone who's had run-ins with a fascist regime or a high school bully can attest that honesty is not always the best policy. But that doesn't explain why I didn't tell the truth. My parents weren't fascists or bullies. They were liberal, bookish Jews raising liberal, bookish daughters. They certainly wouldn't have been shocked or upset at the idea of not believing in God. But they weren't going to hear it from me. It would never have occurred to me to tell the truth. At no point did I express even doubt, much less disbelief. I just played my part. And all I can say, by way of explanation, is this was America. My money said, "In God we trust." My classmates and I stood every day to pledge allegiance to one nation, indivisible, under God. God was America was how every political speech ended. And as a Girl Scout, I had to promise to serve God along with my country. So obviously, a good person, a likable person, a normal person believed in God. Americans believed in God. And I concluded that if I wanted people to like and approve of me, which I definitely did, I should act like I did too. So I didn't tell my parents, who lit the Sabbath candles every Friday, and I didn't tell my rabbi, preparing me for my bat mitzvah, and eventually I got married to another non-believer in a Jewish wedding. Those are two atheists under that chuppah. But don't tell my father-in-law. Behold, you are consecrated to me with this ring according to the laws of Moses and Israel, is what we said with our mouths, while in our heads we consider the laws of Moses and Israel to be bullshit. I promise the rest of the things that I said were, were true, but that part was not. And in one way or another, actively or passively, I pretended to believe. I knew I was lying, but I thought, who was I hurting? Then we had kids. Or rather, people came out of me. Those people came out of me. Having kids is the moment in many people's lives when they return to their synagogues, their churches, or their mosques. Maybe they drifted from their religions when they were in college or right after, but when they have a family, they they feel a responsibility to the next generation. So did I, but in the opposite way. I thought, here are these little developing brains, and it's my job to help them understand the world around them. I conceived an almost physical aversion to telling my kids something I didn't believe to be true. And since I didn't believe God was anything other than a very popular human invention, that's what I told them. One day I sat down with my kids to read from Dolaire's Book of Great Myths. Noah was 5 and Jesse was 3, and one of them asked, what was a myth? What's a myth? And I told them it was a story about how the world works. People used to believe that these gods were in charge of what happened on earth, and these stories helped explain things they didn't understand, like winter, or stars, or thunder. See, look, I flipped ahead to find a picture. Zeus has a thunderbolt. They don't believe them anymore? No, I said. That's why they call it myth. When people still believe it, they call it religion. Like the stories about God and Moses that we read at Passover, or the ones about Jesus and Christmas. They're just made-up stories, like myths, but people still believe them. And that was it. I didn't set out to raise atheists, and I never planned to tell my children that religions were made up. But I had to tell them the truth. So that seems simple, right? And it was simple at first, at home. It was harder out in the world where I was trying to make friends, and I was afraid still of not being liked. But eventually, I forced myself to start being honest in casual conversation. I was not so nearly as confident as cartoon mom there, because what I expected from the other cartoon moms was potentially pure horror. And instead, what I got back was fine. The more that I shared my true beliefs with people, the more I realized maybe I hadn't been the only person in my synagogue to think that the Old Testament God was just a character. Just as I was keeping my beliefs to myself, they may have been keeping their beliefs to themselves. We may all have been pretending. So that's part 1 of my book, why I pretended and how, despite my fear of rejection, I decided to tell the truth. Now, I don't think that everyone who pretends to believe is operating out of a fear of rejection. Another reason people are reluctant to say that they are atheists is because they're afraid to lose the things that they get from religion, or think that they do. So part 2 of my book takes everything that religion can do for people and asks if we can get them another way. So I write about places of worship, I write about prayer, I write about holidays and rites of passage. I write about morality. How do we teach kids right from wrong? How do we know it ourselves without religion? If we don't use God's 10 or 613 commandments, depending on how you count, do we just get to make up our own? And what does that look like? And then, of course, there's death. I think this is my favorite chapter. Death is why religion was invented, I believe, to create this whole fictional structure whereby what happens after we die is, ta-da, we keep on living. It's brilliant. But when you take away that whole fictional structure, what do you do? How do you think about death? How do you talk to your kids about death? Giving up the consolation of an afterlife is hard. But hardest to give up, most important, final chapter in the book, is the idea that there's a supreme being in charge. Atheists have to accept, by definition we do accept, that the world as it is the world as we have made it. And if we want it to change, that's on us. I argued that by being honest about the fact that we didn't believe in divine justice or God's will, or God's mysterious ways, or God's plan. Atheists could help promote the notion that we, not he, are responsible for one another. Still true. But now, the last couple of years in particular, have convinced me that there is another gift that atheists can share with America, have to share with America. Knowing and caring about the difference between fact and fiction. I do hint at this idea in my epilogue, but I had no idea how important it was to become. I wrote that, having been raised as atheists, my children have grown up with a keen sensor for distinguishing fact from fiction. They know bullshit when they hear it, but they also know great art when they experience it. They have become able critics and artists and cultural consumers, and not incidentally, engaged and informed and savvy citizens. Today, our president and his party are trying to turn back all the progress we've made in human rights, civil rights, environmental protection, medicine, everything. And the primary weapon that they wield is a contempt for the notion of verifiable reality. I believe Americans are susceptible to this weapon, peculiarly susceptible to this weapon, in part because of religion. Factual truth is not, shall we say, a highly valued commodity in religious circles. In order to believe in God, let alone the particular stories in any holy book, one must dispense with the usual methods for determining whether something actually happened. Verifiable physical evidence, corroborating first-hand reports of witnesses, disprovability, logical plausibility, that sort of thing. To have faith, religiously speaking, is to decide that such rules need not apply, at least not in this one area of life. Religion teaches us that it's okay to look at an obvious fiction and call it fact. When that attitude spreads beyond holy books and houses of worship into the civic sphere, we're in trouble. So, folks, we're in trouble. I don't know if you remember this moment last summer when J.D. Vance was asked about the lies his campaign was spreading about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Illinois. He said, "If I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention to the suffering of the American people, then that's what I'm going to do." So not only was the Trump campaign telling lies, it rebranded lying as storytelling, which Vance defended as a kind of truth-telling. I'm pretty sure I've heard the same argument about the Bible. So the campaign is over, but the lies are unrelenting. Here's just one recent example about crime in DC. I could have picked literally any White House statement. In addition to lying, they are also working hard to create citizens who simply don't care about factual truth. Historical truth, biological fact, environmental data, they want us not to care about any of it. And one way they're doing that is by bringing religion into our schools. You've probably heard that Texas has a new Bible-based public school curriculum. And I know that the FFRF has been actively fighting this development in defense of the separation of church and state. Amen to that. But I am also concerned with defending the separation of fact and fiction. So here, for example, is a second grade English lesson from Bluebonnet Learning about Queen Esther, who, according to legend, and not to verifiable historical fact, saved the Jewish people by giving them a heads up that her husband planned to kill them. Queen Esther would be a fine character to discuss if she were presented alongside other literary figures. Instead, she's treated like a historical figure, like Martin Luther King, Jackie Robinson, and Rosa Parks. Children are supposed to learn that Esther made a difference that not only affected the Jews of Persia, but also Jewish people today. You know, the way Dorothy made a difference not only to the Ozians of yesterday, but to the Kansans of today. Meanwhile, Oklahoma, I'll pause so we can all hiss at Ryan Walters here, has developed new social studies standards that require students to be able to discuss the meanings and effects of Jesus' words as recorded by Matthew, and the role of Abraham and Moses in Hebrew migrations as recorded in the book of Exodus. Jesus, Abraham, Moses, they sound like historical figures, and certainly the word recorded implies historical events that were observed and documented by multiple sources, and including these figures in a social studies curriculum with actual historical figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar makes them seem historical, but they are not. They are figures of myth and legend. Now, technically, we're just talking about 2 states here. But in every state in America, private religious schools are visibly blurring fact and fiction. They teach that creation happened in 6 days and a great flood wiped out every animal that didn't have a ticket to the ark. They teach that evolution is a retreat from true science. And they teach that geology and the fossil record support the biblical record of a worldwide flood, not the hypotheses of evolution. This is 100 years after the Scopes trial, and this is happening all across America. Now, what are you going to do, right? Christians are going to be Christianing. But this Christian school in Tennessee, like thousands around the country, is supported by taxpayer dollars in the form of vouchers, which is money that the state gives parents to spend on private school, any private school, even religious ones. In fact, according to the Washington Post, mostly religious ones. So that means that while most of the states pictured there in blue, those are the universal voucher programs were pictured in blue, most of those states have perfectly acceptable, Bible-free science standards. They're also using tax dollars to teach some students the opposite of science. And all of us, without that voucher programs, are at risk of supporting the very same thing now that Trump has pushed a national voucher program in the form of a massive tax rebate into his, what did you call it? A monstrous, ugly bill. Into his big, beautiful bill. I can't just blame Trump or even Christian nationalism, our nice blue state here in New York. Just back down on stricter education oversight of religious schools. I guess because Democrats didn't want to alienate certain conservative downstate voters by requiring that yeshiva students actually learn stuff. But what happens if we don't insist on children's right to factual, reality-based education? What happens if children don't learn to distinguish fact from fiction? The historian and philosopher Hannah Arendt said, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between the true and the false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist." It's happening, and it's happening in the schools. Those same Oklahoma standards that treat Exodus like it really happened also ask students to identify the source of the COVID-19 pandemic from a Chinese lab and to identify discrepancies in the 2020 elections results. Like those things really happened. There are so many battles to fight now. I know we're all feeling this. Keeping the Bible out of public schools certainly feels, at least to me, less urgent than keeping ICE out. But they are connected. And our job as atheists and freethinkers is still crucial. When we fight to keep the Bible out of our schools, we are fighting to keep out lies, we are fighting to keep out misinformation, we are fighting a disrespect for the notion of factual truth itself. All of which is catastrophic to those little developing brains and to the future of our country. So that's it for me for now. Here's all my information. If you have any questions,